Ukraine tipped to deliver major blow to Putin's collapsing military before winter. Viktor Kovalenko, a former Ukrainian army officer who fought against the Russians in the 2014 war, told Express.co.uk that the battlefield situation is advantageous for them in the south and they are actively exploiting it. The recapture of Kherson by Ukrainian forces will be the next major blow for Putin, according to a former Ukrainian army officer. The strategically important port city is located on the western bank of the Dnipro River and provides access to the Black Sea. It fell to the invading Russian army in the first few days of the war, when its defenders fled without putting up a fight. At the end of August, Ukraine's military confirmed it had started a counteroffensive to liberate the Kherson province and its regional capital. The counterattack has made steady progress, with Kyiv's commanders claiming to have retaken 1,200 square kilometers of territory as of October 9. Recent days have seen increased speculation that Russia is on the brink of abandoning the city and pulling its forces from the right side of the Dnipro. Residents in the regional capital even started receiving text messages from Russian occupation authorities on Tuesday, urging them to leave. Viktor Kovalenko, a former Ukrainian army officer who fought against the Russians in the 2014 war, told Express.co.uk that the liberation of the west bank of the Dnipro River and the recapture of Kherson was a priority objective for Kyiv before the winter and was a realistic goal. He said, "The battlefield situation is advantageous for them in that area and they are actively exploiting it." The recapture of Kherson city will surely be the next major blow for Putin and another hit on the low morale of Russian troops. The Russian military is already collapsing. If Kyiv succeeds in liberating the regional capital and the province, then the question arises whether Crimea might be the next to fall. Mr. Kovalenko believes that Ukraine's army does not have the capability just yet to expel the Russians from the peninsula. He explained, "The recapture of Kherson won't automatically mean that Crimea will be the next objective for Kyiv anytime soon. The peninsula is heavily militarized and the liberation of it requires many Ukrainian reserve brigades." He added, "Its liberation requires a complex military and political solution, may be tough to level negotiations with the Kremlin." The former army officer, who took part in the Battle of Debaltseve in 2015, sees no let-up in fighting over the winter, arguing that Ukraine's army will seek to press home its advantages against a demoralized and poorly led Russian army. He said, "I think that the most realistic scenario is that Ukraine will not stop its push, its active counteroffensive till spring. The Ukrainian armed forces are already warmed up, motivated, and have the best morale and good supplies after the battlefield successes in September. Therefore, even winter won't slow Ukrainians down." Moreover, he pointed out that Ukraine's army has experience of winter combat from the 2014 conflict and that frozen land makes it easier for heavy armor to move around. Mr. Kovalenko predicted that after the recapture of Kherson the focus of the military campaign will switch back to the east, with the liberation of the Donbas the next major objective over the coming 6 months. His remarks come as the commander of Russian forces in Ukraine said on Tuesday that a difficult situation had emerged in the Kherson region. General Sergei Shurivkin told Russian media that he endorsed plans by the region's occupation authorities to evacuate civilians. The UK's Ministry of Defence said in its Thursday bulletin that the general's comments indicated that Russia is seriously considering a major withdrawal of its forces from the area west of the Dnipro River. Russia's mobilized troops in Kherson could crumble if Ukraine attacks. Newly mobilized Russian soldiers covering their forces' retreat from western Kherson could face a rout at the hands of Ukrainian troops, according to the Institute for the Study of War, ISW. The U.S. think tank said on Friday that Russia has started its withdrawal from the southern region and this was likely to continue over the next few weeks, but Vladimir Putin's troops could face a struggle if Ukrainian forces choose to attack. Ukraine's Southern Operational Command has said Moscow is transferring ammunition, military equipment and units via ferry from the Dnipro River's west bank to the east bank, while 2,000 Russian troops hold the front line to cover their withdrawal by shelling Ukrainian positions. The ISW said that the Russian withdrawal requires a detachment that is well-trained, professional, and prepared to die for its compatriots to be left to hold the line against Ukrainian attack. But Deputy Chief of the Main Operational Department of the Ukrainian General Staff, Brigadier General Alexei Romov, said Russia may withdraw its most combat-capable units from the left bank of the river and leave mobilized soldiers to cover the retreat. The ISW noted that if this was true, then Russian forces would be setting conditions for a Russian withdrawal to become a rout. Russia's poorly trained, newly mobilized reservists are very unlikely to stand and resist a Ukrainian counterattack, it said, which could lead to a rout on the same scale as Ukraine's rout of Russian forces in Kharkiv. British defense officials said on Saturday that Russian forces are reinforcing crossing points over the Dnipro River near Kherson and for the first time in decades were using a barge bridge next to the damaged Antonovsky Bridge. Meanwhile, there are growing fears that Russian forces are set to try to blow up the dam at the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant, HPP, and blame it on Kyiv, to cover their withdrawal and stop Ukrainian forces pursuing Russian forces deeper into Kherson Oblast. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called on the West to deter Russia from blowing up the dam holding back an enormous reservoir, which would flood swathes of southern Ukraine and create a large-scale disaster. However, a Russian-appointed official in Kherson, Kirill Stremausov, said that Kyiv's claims Moscow had mined the dam were false. It comes as U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, told reporters on Friday that Washington would maintain links with Moscow, but any broader diplomacy depends on Putin showing an interest in stopping the aggression. "We have seen no evidence of that in this moment," Blinken said. "We see Russia doubling and tripling down on its aggression. Russia planning mass withdrawal to avoid devastating rout in Ukraine. Russia likely plans a mass withdrawal from vulnerable positions in the southern Kherson region to avoid a devastating rout in Ukraine," a U.S. think tank has assessed, amid Kyiv's advance in its counteroffensive. As Moscow anticipates imminent Ukrainian advances in Kherson, it is likely setting conditions to remove military and occupation elements along the western bank of the Dnieper River, according to the Institute for the Study of War, ISW. In recent weeks, Ukrainian troops have been pressing ahead with a counteroffensive in the region, which was seized by Russian forces in the early days of the war. Kyiv has taken back settlements along the western bank of the Dnieper River since early September. Meanwhile, Russian officials, and hosts and guests on Russian state TV, appear to be preparing citizens for bad news amid Kyiv's intensifying counteroffensive. Kherson residents and pro-Russian officials began to leave Kherson on Wednesday, with authorities saying that they plan to transport about 50,000 to 60,000 people to the east bank of the Dnieper River within a week. Citing unverified reports from Telegram accounts based in Kherson City, the ISW said that Russian forces disbanded and looted a fire station in the city, and ferried fire trucks, stolen civilian cars, and other miscellaneous household items across the Dnieper River to Ola Pristan, another city in the Kherson region. The ISW noted that the Ukrainian service of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, also reported on Thursday that Russian forces are now moving military equipment from the west bank to the east bank of the Dnieper River in the face of recent Ukrainian advances. The outlet published satellite imagery that appears to show a Russian cargo ferry traveling across the Dnieper River from Kozatsk, located on the west bank, to Novokakhovka, on the east bank. The think tank said these reports indicate that Russian President Vladimir Putin's troops are likely deliberately removing large amounts of personnel and equipment from the west bank of the Dnieper River amid Ukrainian advances. Russian forces have likely learned, at least in part, from their failures during the panicked Russian retreat from Kharkiv Oblast in the face of a previous Ukrainian counteroffensive, the ISW assessed, referring to a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in northeast Ukraine last month that saw Kyiv recapture swathes of its territory in just weeks. The militarily sensible thing would be to remove men and equipment in good order to avoid another devastating rout. Such a rout in Kherson could trap Russian forces and equipment on the west bank of the Dnieper River, the ISW said. Putin on Wednesday announced that he had signed a law introducing martial law in Kherson, and 3 other Ukrainian regions that he proclaimed to have formally annexed, in violation of international law. Meanwhile, the new commander of Putin's army in Ukraine, General Sergei Surovikin, told the state-run Russia 24 TV news channel this week that the situation is not easy in Kherson, and that hard decisions must be made. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said on Friday that up to 2,000 Russian conscripts have arrived in Kherson to make up for Putin's combat losses.